And I want to talk today a little bit about what the Biden administration is facing as it deals with the Middle East. There are a lot of different issues I could touch on. Uh, I can easily talk about what's going on with Iran right now. I can talk about, uh, in effect, what I call the shadow war between Israel and Iran, which is becoming less and less of a shadow and more of a more direct conflict. But I would really like to create a frame or a context for our discussion. So what I really want to do is give you a presentation that pretty much outlines uh, what's happening, what's the landscape of the Middle East? What is it that the Biden administration faces as it looks at the Middle East and as it considers what it's going to do, recognizing that the President Biden has made it very clear his priorities are not only domestic, but to the extent to which he's focused on foreign policy, it's on reestablishing the US as a good global citizen, reestablishing American leadership in the world, because as he has said, when the US doesn't lead, no one leads, or there's chaos, or there's a vacuum in which the worst forces fill it. And given that, how do we reestablish that leadership, but with a focal point on how we compete with China? As you listen to the president speak, as you listen to the Secretary of State speak, what you see is that the Middle East is not a priority area. Not particularly surprising. We now have the imagery of forever conflicts there, forever wars. And that has obviously shaped, I think, the attitudes of the administration, particularly when it thinks about the priority of competing with China. And yet, as I know from a lot of experience, and I never tire of saying it, you may ignore the Middle East, but the Middle East won't ignore you. And the Las Vegas rules don't apply in the Middle East. What takes place in the Middle East doesn't stay in the Middle East. So let's talk a little bit about what the Middle East looks like. We're going to do some screen sharing right now. My assistant Will Ellison is going to put up a map of the Middle East. Right, so here we have the whole Middle East. President Biden is basically inherited three conflicts in the region. So there's a conflict in Syria. And you can see the arrow pointing to Syria. The Russians are in Syria as part of this conflict, saving Bashar al-Assad, the president of Syria. The Iranians are in Syria in a significant way. Turkey has a presence in both northwestern Syria, in what's known as the Idlib area, and it also has a buffer area in the northeastern part of Syria. The US has a very small presence, both along the Jordanian Syrian border in a place called Al-Tanaf, which happens to run right along the Damascus-Baghdad highway. We have a very small presence, but it's nonetheless, there is one. And we have a small presence up in the northeastern part of Syria. Now, this is a conflict that continues to, not only it continues to smolder on, which is the best way to describe it, but it also contains the seeds of escalation. And I say that because the Iranians have been embedding themselves in Syria, but not just embedding themselves in Syria. What the Iranians have been doing is they have a precision-guided project. What I mean by precision-guided project is the Iranians have provided Hezbollah in Lebanon, which is, you can see, next to Syria, with between about 130,000 rockets. Most of those rockets are guided inertially. What that means is they literally follow a ballistic path. When a missile is fired into the area, it reaches its high point, its apex, and then gravity takes it down. So the missile is not, there's no guidance to a target. It's basically an area-wide projectile. And for Israel, dealing with that is a lot simpler than it is dealing with what would be missiles that have a terminal guidance. Israel has developed a layered missile defense, which is quite effective, but also the way it operates is it basically can ignore those missiles or rockets that are going to land in open areas, that aren't going to hit anything of value. Now, if suddenly tens of thousands of the rockets that Hezbollah has have a terminal guidance, then suddenly they can overwhelm Israel, because Israel is a small country, as you can see, with a very limited number of high-value targets, both economically and militarily. So Israel really can't live with the Hezbollah rockets and rockets that are being brought into Syria suddenly being able to have the kind of accuracy that would threaten all the most important targets in Israel. And that's why Israel has actually carried out probably 1,200 attacks into Syria, trying to blunt the transfer of the weapons and even the capabilities to fabricate locally terminal guidance to apply to the rockets. Now, I say this has the potential to escalate because Israel has mostly struck at these targets in Syria, but some of these capabilities have gotten into Lebanon. And there will come a point where the Hezbollah possession of a certain threshold, I can't say exactly what the number would be that would trigger more direct Israeli responses or attacks against the sites in Lebanon. But the Israelis know that Hezbollah has made it clear, you attack us in Lebanon, we will attack you in Israel. And the problem here is that the only way that war can stop is with Israel going in on the ground. A war between Hezbollah and Israel will be a terrible war. Much worse for Hezbollah and much worse for Lebanon than Israel, but nonetheless, you could easily see Israelis being hit by 2,000 rockets a day at a minimum, being forced increasingly to live not just in the northern part of Israel, but throughout Israel, because Hezbollah probably has, out of the 130,000 rockets, they probably have at least 30,000 that can cover half of Israel, and they probably have 15,000 that can cover all of Israel. So Israel can't wait to be hit. It will go in on the ground to try to root this out. Cost will be high. And Israel won't simply put itself in a position where it can be hit with 2,000 rockets a day, and the Iranians sit off in Tehran, having been responsible for providing the means and probably having provoked this in some fashion, and being untouched. So Israel will hit high-value strategic targets in Iran if there is a war between Israel and Hezbollah, meaning when Israel talks about a northern front, what you're talking about basically is a war that escalates vertically, but also horizontally. It's not a war you want to see, but it's part and parcel of the Iranian push to create a precision-guided project and put precision terminal guidance on the rockets they've been providing to Hezbollah and that they're bringing into Syria. So that's conflict number one that the Biden administration faces in the region. Let's look at conflict number two in Libya. Here, you have the Russians involved on the side of what was a warring force out of Benghazi, where Will has the arrow is about where Benghazi is. There is the internationally backed government that is in Tripoli. That's backed by Turkey. What's interesting is Turkey and Russia, both in Syria and in Libya, had been on the opposite sides, and yet in both places they have worked out what amounts to kind of a limited modus vivendi. Now, what has transpired in Libya right now looks a little bit more hopeful. There's very little prospect of any change in Syria. In Libya, there is an interim government that has been appointed that is supposed to define before the end of the year a constitution and set up elections that would have it replaced. This interim government is presently supported by what have been the warring forces in both the western and eastern part of Libya. And in theory, the Russians and the Turks, who basically are the largest external forces in Libya, and as I said, having been on opposite sides, with Turkey having pretty much saved the Tripoli-based government, neither one of them, while they support what is a ceasefire that is generally holding, and while they support this political process with an interim government, the understanding that was worked out for the interim government also said all foreign forces are supposed to leave Libya, and the influx of weapons is supposed to stop. Neither of those things have taken place. You have about 20,000 foreign forces in Libya, and what it suggests is that while the political process is hopeful at the moment, it still is resting on, I think, very uncertain grounds. And the very factors that have produced the conflict in the first place still exist on the ground. Here again, we have a conflict that isn't self-contained, not only because you have these foreign actors in it, but also because Libya has been a jumping off point for a lot of refugees and migrants trying to go to Europe. So there is that is one way in which the orbit of this conflict expands, but also a lot of weapons proliferation from Libya into Africa. So this is not a self-contained conflict. And here again, you have the potential for escalation in Syria, you have the potential for escalation in Libya. Let's go to the third conflict, which is Yemen. Yemen is a conflict that began when the Houthis, who are a Shia offshoot, overthrew what was the government in Sana'a. It is interesting that you look at Yemen and they have what's known as northern Yemen. Yemen at one point was divided between northern Yemen and southern Yemen. And Aden is in the south, and it was sort of really the capital of when Yemen was divided into two states. I oftentimes wonder whether when this conflict is resolved, will we not again see Yemen be divided into two states? But right now, it's not resolved. The potential of famine in Yemen is extremely high. The numbers of malnourished children in Yemen is at least 2 million. It is an awful conflict with terrible human consequences. I didn't even talk about the human consequences of Syria, where 600,000 have been killed. The numbers here may not be as high, but they're still very gruesome in terms of their human toll. And it's basically a proxy conflict between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And the Iranians see this as a very easy, low-cost way to them of bleeding Saudi Arabia. The Houthis, who claim to be independent of the Iranians, it would be easier to take their claims of independence more seriously if they also didn't have their slogans of death to the Jews, death to Israel, death to America. It's really pretty hard to see how, if you're sitting in Yemen, you have much of an interest in any of those issues, and those slogans just tend to mirror what you hear coming out of Iran. Moreover, the weapons that have come to the Houthis have come from the Iranians, and Hezbollah from Lebanon is probably the main. They have groups on the ground who train the Houthis, and they also the Iranians bring people from Yemen, from Sana'a, to Iran for extensive training, again in the conduct of war and in the conduct of how to use the materials, mostly cruise missiles, drones, and even rockets that the Iranians have provided them. There has been a serious increase in the number of Houthi attacks into Saudi Arabia. Starting early this year, there used to be about 5 attacks a month. Each attack wasn't just one rocket or one cruise missile or drone. Sometimes there would be swarms of drones. Those have gone up to almost daily attacks, increasingly going after Saudi oil facilities throughout all of Saudi Arabia, not just in the Red Sea area, but also where Will has the arrow. Much of the Saudi oil infrastructure is in the northeast corner, and the Houthis have fired rockets from Sana'a all the way over there. So this too is a conflict that has the potential to erupt. It also, if you go down, you'll see the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. Now, the Bab el-Mandeb Strait is where about 10% of the world's oil petrochemical supplies transit. This is obviously, you see at the mouth of the Red Sea. The Iranians this past week had a Revolutionary Guard ship called the Saviz, which was mysteriously attacked, probably by the Israelis. And it was a ship that was pretty much running the command, control, and intelligence operations in Yemen for the Houthis. So here again, you see the potential for a conflict not to be localized. And this is a kind of what I'll call the conflictual landscape that faces the region, when I haven't even though I've touched on the Iranians, I've made a reference to the Israelis, I'm not explicitly talking about the conflict between them, although we can certainly get into that. All right, so that's kind of the starting point. That's kind of I'm going to move from what is the bad news situation into, what shall I call it? More bad news, before I move into something that might be a little bit more hopeful. I want to talk about the groupings in the region. This is a region that is characterized by three different groupings of countries. The first grouping is Iran and the Shia militias. Iran has created very significant leverage using the coercive power of the Shia militias. When we think Shia militias, Hezbollah is what you think about first and foremost in Lebanon, and the Iranians have used Hezbollah to train many of the other Shia militias. In Syria, the Iranians brought Shia militias from as far away, this extends beyond the map, but from as far away as Afghanistan and Pakistan, both of which border Iran to the east. They brought these into Syria. They brought Shia militias out of Iraq into Syria. And they have used Shia militias as a kind of coercive edge to extend their influence, to create intimidation, and basically to strengthen their ability to shape events in different countries in the region. Where they have a kind of predominant influence, although in the first case, which is Iraq, it's somewhat offset by us, but I would say only partially. They have predominant influence in four Arab countries: Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. Now, what's noteworthy about those four states, three of them, meaning Yemen, Lebanon, and Syria, are either failed or failing states. And Iraq is a state that one can say is very challenged. It's sort of a diplomatic term. It is a country that still faces a lot of the legacy of the past and of the wars there, and they're constrained. The Iraqi government is very powerfully constrained by the Shia militias that the Iranians train, fund, arm, and guide. And their focus is on trying to get the U.S. out of Iraq. We still have a presence of probably about 3,000 forces, 3,000 to 4,000 forces in Iraq. And our presence is mostly designed to help the Iraqi government deal with terror. The Shia militias put a lot of pressure on the government and basically represent the kind of cutting edge of the Iranians. And the Iranians look at a certain level, to be fair, having fought an 8.5-year war with Iraq in the 1980s, where the toll was extremely high in both countries. We're talking about 500,000 that the Iranians lost. Obviously, they have an interest in what goes on in Iraq, and the Iraqis are prepared to have good relations with Iran, but they're not prepared to be in a position where Iran can pretty much determine what they can do and deny them what could be very much in their interests. The interesting thing about what I said when I refer to these different countries, as I said, they all look like they're failing. It hardly creates a model of attraction for those in the rest of the region. If you want Iran to have dominant influence, then you're going to have a country that looks like Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen. Not very attractive, not very appealing to most people in the Middle East. So that's grouping number one. Grouping number two is Turkey, Qatar, and here you can't really point to what I'm going to say, and the Muslim Brotherhood. Turkey is led by President Erdogan. He heads a party called the AKP, which is an Islamist party, meaning it is a religiously based party. Islam is a religion. Islamism, or an Islamist, is an ideological viewpoint where you're using Islam, the religion, to seize political power. And that's Erdogan. Erdogan's popularity is dropping in Turkey because of the economic difficulties, because he really is introducing and has removed the secular tradition of Ataturk. His popularity, I would say, has dropped pretty dramatically given the COVID and its aftermath, but he seeks to build his nationalist credentials and support for him by pretty much being active throughout the region and trying to build Turkey's presence and influence throughout the region. So as I said, Turkey has a military presence in northern Iraq. It has a military presence in northwest and northeast Syria. I mentioned that before. It has a military presence in Somalia, which is down at the bottom of the screen. It has a military presence in Libya. It has a military presence in Qatar. And it seeks to build greater influence throughout the region. Now, I mentioned this grouping, not only because I think it's significant and it's part of the landscape, but also because you will hear the conflicts in the Middle East are Sunni Shia. They're not Sunni Shia. Turkey, Qatar, and the Muslim Brotherhood, they're Sunni. Iran and the Shia militias, they're Shia. These are countries that are not at war or in conflict, or even, I would even say, not much competition with the Iranians. It isn't to say there's never competition between Turkey and Iran, but there's also as much cooperation between the two. So when you hear about conflicts, they're not Sunni Shia conflicts. Yemen, as I said, may be a proxy conflict between Saudi Arabia and Iran, but it's not a Sunni Shia conflict. Okay, so that's the second grouping. The third grouping is basically most of the Sunni Arab states, the remaining Sunni Arab states, so Saudi Arabia, the UAE in particular, Oman, Kuwait is sort of on the fence. Qatar is obviously part of a different grouping, and I would say then Egypt, Jordan, and Morocco. Algeria and Tunisia are too consumed domestically to be part of this grouping. But this grouping includes all these Sunni Arab states with Israel. Now we begin to move into what is a more hopeful reality. This grouping has emerged over the course of the last decade. It began to emerge because the Gulf states in particular felt increasingly threatened not only by Iran and the Shia militias, but also by the Muslim Brotherhood. And they looked at who had a similar kind of strategic perspective, who shared the same threat perceptions as they did, and they increasingly saw Israel. That wouldn't have been enough. What added to their attraction to Israel was not just that Israel was a bulwark against the threats they most faced, and that what they most feared, but also because the US was signaling increasingly we wanted out of the region. It began under Obama, it certainly continued under Trump. President Biden is making it clear that we want to have a reduced footprint in the region. The more there was a perception that you could count on the US less, the more these Arab leaders began to look around, well, who can be of help to us? Who can help secure us? They looked at the Russians and said, no, the Russians actually are producing most of the problems, because part of the problem was coming out of Syria, which was deepening the expansion of Iran. They look at China and say China is mostly focused in a mercantile way and trying to build through the Belt and Road Initiative infrastructure, but they're not a security. They're not a security ally. They looked at the Europeans, they saw the Europeans really weren't so capable of acting, and they looked at Israel. And they said, here's a country that actually acts more than it talks, and it's the only country that's actually actively blunting some of the threats we most fear. You look at what the Israelis are doing in the Sinai, basically to blunt ISIS. You see what the Israelis have done quietly to help Jordan against ISIS and threats from Islamists. And obviously what the Israelis have done vis-a-vis the Iranians on both the nuclear issue and clearly what they've been doing in the region, especially in Syria. So they saw that Israel was a real bulwark against the threats they saw on the one hand. And they also knew, unlike the United States, Israel couldn't go anywhere. So Israel's stake in countering these threats was fundamental, and it reflected their basic interests. Now, the convergence in this grouping began purely on a security basis, but it has evolved. And it has evolved because all of these Sunni Arab leaderships also realize they need to improve their own performance. They need to improve their governance. They need to address the provision of services, because they realize they have populations that have demonstrated back in the end of 2010, 2011, when what was known as the Arab Spring and really what I call the Arab Awakening, that their publics won't suppress their discontent. And so there's a need to address genuine issues, especially in the aftermath of COVID, economically, but not just that. I mean, COVID brings to mind the need to address health issues, health security. Well, Israel can be of help there. Climate change and drought is having a profound effect on water availability in the region. Who is the leading user, developer, expander of water? Israel. Israel reuses 90% of its wastewater. 90% of its wastewater. I'm repeating that point for emphasis. The country closest, the next closest country in terms of amount of wastewater treated and reused is Italy at about 17%. No one comes close to what the Israelis do. Now, obviously, when you can reuse 90% of your wastewater, you're expanding the availability of water you have. But Israel does other things. They lead the world in drip irrigation. They lead the world in terms of having created now drought-resistant crops. They now have, an Israeli company has succeeded in growing wheat and rice, which are two staples, but have always been water-intensive crops. There's now Israeli companies that have developed the ability to grow wheat and rice with a fraction of the water that was historically required. All these things create the possibility of greatly expanding water availability. So if you're dealing with health questions, well, Israel can help. If you're dealing with the acute water problems, Israel can help. If you're dealing with food security problems, Israel can help. If you're dealing with cybersecurity issues, Israel can help. What began purely as common security interests, a convergence of strategic threat perceptions, has begun to evolve in terms of Arab states, Sunni Arab states looking at Israel as their natural partner, and now believing they can gain something from that relationship. You saw in the Trump administration, the Abraham Accords. I like to say, I try to be fair to everybody. In this case, the Trump administration deserves some credit, although we have to put it in some perspective. The real hero of the Abraham Accords was the UAE, because it was the UAE ambassador to Washington who went to Jared Kushner in July of 2020 and said, we can give you a win in foreign policy. We can give you the first peace treaty between Israel and Arab states since 1994 in the Jordan-Israeli peace treaty. But there's a price. The price is you have to address our security needs, meaning you have to sell us weapons that have been denied us because we're not at peace with Israel. And you have to stop the annexation process. Bibi Netanyahu, Prime Minister Netanyahu, had said he was going to annex the territories that were allotted to Israel in the Trump peace plan. And the UAE said, if that goes forward, no normalization. But we'll do full normalization, and it'll be a warm peace because we see a stake in real cooperation with Israel. And this is a peace that doesn't look like the peace between Israel and Egypt, which remains a cold peace. Doesn't look like the peace between Jordan and Israel, which also remains a cold peace. You had, in the midst of the COVID pandemic, you've had more than 130,000 Israelis travel to the UAE. You have large numbers of business deals that have now been cut. When the Israelis and the Emirates were negotiating over how many flights a week there should be between Israel and the Emirates, the Israeli position going in was 2 flights a day. And the Emirati position was, you've got to be kidding. You've just got to be kidding. There needs to be no less than 4 flights a day. And the Emirati Etihad, which is the Abu Dhabi airline, has initiated its flights. Israel now has flights both to Abu Dhabi and Dubai. And Israeli products are displayed in Emirati markets with all sorts of fanfare, and they're almost like a magnet. For those there, you have large numbers of Emiratis now, and they're not, when I say large numbers of Emiratis are not large in number. But there's an interesting, something like between 5 and 10,000 Emiratis are now studying Hebrew. I mean, this is transformative in terms of the meaning of peace. Now, it also can be something that breaks the stalemate between Israelis and Palestinians. And I'll conclude with this. There is a complete stalemate between Israelis and Palestinians. There is disbelief between the two sides. We've had 4 Israeli elections now in the last 2 years. Go back to 2015, when you had an election before that. Not in any of those elections did you have peace as an issue, because in the Israeli body politic, that would make you look naive. It would make you look as if you had no idea of what was going on in the region. And on the Palestinian side, they stick to their slogans. So the politics on each side make any kind of serious move almost impossible, and the psychological gap makes it almost impossible. But this new dynamic with this third grouping and the normalization process creates the potential to change things, and let me explain how. I already said that the UAE, when it normalized with Israel, it said you can normalize, we will normalize, but no annexation. In effect, what they did is they related their making full peace with Israel to non-annexation, meaning a step that Israel wouldn't take towards the Palestinians. So they created a relationship between what they did and what Israel would do towards the Palestinians. This was the absence of a negative move. You can imagine Saudi Arabia contemplating this, and there are signs that they're contemplating it, although they're not about to rush into it, partly because they were the authors of something called the Arab Peace Initiative back in 2002, adopted by the Arab League. The premise of that was completely opposite of what the UAE has done in basically beginning the Abraham Accords, which led to their peace agreement, Bahrain's peace agreement, Sudan, and Morocco with Israel. The Arab Peace Initiative was premised on the idea that Israel withdraws fully from the occupied territories, ends occupation, and then there'd be formal diplomatic relations. Sort of formal diplomatic relations were promised only after Israel withdrew and ended occupation. That's not what you saw here. Here, normalization was the starting point, and there was a step that Israel wouldn't take. Now, Saudi Arabia could say, we'll move in stages, much the way the Emirates did. The Emirates basically, they began building a relationship with the Israelis very quietly back in 2009. So they were doing this for more than a decade. They were going public with parts of this gradually. They crossed the threshold when they felt the need to stop annexation. The Saudis could say, okay, we're going to move in stages too. And for every step that the Saudis might take in terms of public outreach towards Israel, they could say, look, this is what we would like to see you do towards the Palestinians. Now, it's unlikely to happen on its own. It will require, I think, brokering, and only the US could do it. But I'll give you an example. I mean, I have come up with a menu of steps that the Saudis could take, steps that the Israelis could take in response, and steps you would ask the Palestinians to take in response to what the Israelis have done. But I'll give you one example. Let's say the Saudis, they're not going to establish formal diplomatic relations, but they'll open a trade office. And they say to the Israelis, we would like you, we're going to do this, but here's what we'd like of you. We would like you to stop building outside the settlement blocks. Now, let me explain what the settlement blocks are. Back before we went to Camp David in the summer of the year 2000, as I was our negotiator, I was focused on how could we work out the border issues. I knew the border had to be adjusted from what it was. There were both strategic reasons for it. Excuse me. There were also demographic reasons for it. And 80% of all the Israeli settlers live on about 5 to 6% of the West Bank that is closest to the Green Line, the June 467 lines. We came up with the concept of, well, since that's the reality of the way the vast majority of Israelis live in the West Bank, let's say this area, these block areas will be absorbed into Israel, and then there'll be a territorial and other compensation to the Palestinians for the territory that's absorbed into Israel. When Israel builds in the settlement blocks, that's consistent with a two-state outcome. When Israel builds outside the settlement blocks, it's inconsistent with a two-state outcome because it becomes very difficult to separate Israelis from Palestinians. So the Saudis could basically say, okay, here's a trade office which shows we're on the way to normalization. We'd like you to stop building outside the settlement blocks. Excuse excuse me. And in doing that, what the Israelis would be doing would, I think, would have a political basis. Just to give you a sense of why it would have a political basis, even though the settlers are very strongly would be against this, when Prime Minister Netanyahu went along with the normalization for no annexation, he was backed by 80% of the Israeli public. Now, 80% of the Israeli public can't believe whether it's day or night, but 80% of the Israeli public preferred normalization to annexation. So what the Saudis could offer is, I think, likely to be supported because the Israeli public would see what they're getting in terms of genuine normalization and what amounts to the real peacemaking in the area. One of the limits of peacemaking up until now was it was dealing with Israel as a fact, not as a legitimate, not recognizing the legitimacy of Israel's reality. And what you see with the peace between the UAE and Israel in particular, there's a focus on the legitimacy of this, the value of warm peace. So this won't happen by itself. The Saudis are not going to initiate something the way the Emirates did, but they would respond, I think, to an American effort. The Biden administration has made it clear it wants to build on the normalization process. So far that it's just saying that, but it's not doing anything. To be fair to the administration, one of the reasons I think it's not doing much is not only because it's distracted, but also because it has very few of the senior people who are to be confirmed by the Senate. They have very few people in their offices. One of the things that I will be watching and also pushing for is for the administration not simply to say that it supports the normalization process, but to act on that. Passively supporting it means nothing. Actively going to broker it is the way you can build on it. And it will deepen that coalition that is basically countering Iran. It has the other virtue of not just countering Iran, it has the other virtue of making peace a much deeper part of the landscape, but it also offers the one potential to break the stalemate between Israelis and Palestinians. Ultimately, that is very much in Israel's interest, because if Israel stays on the path it's on right now, it will become one state for two people, because it will lose the ability to separate. So long as it keeps building outside the settlement blocks, the numbers now outside the settlement blocks are up to about 115,000. If that number keeps going up, there's going to come a point where you lose the ability to separate. So building on the normalization process is ultimately in Israel's interest from a variety of standpoints, including the ability to preserve Israel as a Jewish democratic state. Okay, why don't I stop there?
Ambassador Ross, thank you so much. That was extremely informative and I think a wonderful educational opportunity. And so thank you so much. And thank you to Will for your assistance with the map. We had somebody who said, and I think everybody agreed that that was very helpful to see it in live time and to follow what you were saying about that. We are opening it up to questions. So if you do have any questions for Ambassador Ross, please start to put those into the chat and I will give those to Ambassador Ross. We did have one question from earlier back near the beginning of your talk. Somebody was asking, what is Turkey's interest in Libya? I'm not sure if you covered that a little bit, but that was one of the questions.
Yeah, I was, first of all, it touches the Eastern Mediterranean. Turkey competes with Greece, sees itself in competition with Greece. Israeli, Greek, and Cypriot understandings on natural gas is something that the Turks would like to, I would say, frustrate. Turkey has extensive claims. And they want to claim a very extensive economic zone. And by linking up with Libya, A, Libya has oil, and B, they create an understanding of what constitutes their mutual economic zones. So that's the major factor that's influencing what they're doing in Libya, in addition to the fact that they seek to promote Turkish influence increasingly throughout the region.
And then we had a question regarding Iran and Lebanon. How are Iran and Lebanon getting their weapons to Yemen?
Um, mostly by shipping, some by aircraft. Um, in the case of the Iranians, there are what are known as these dhow, these small, what look like small sailing vessels, where that are responsible for a lot of the local commerce, and they go ahead and they create crates that look like they're trading what are legitimate goods, and they're packed with arms. So some of the arms get there that way. Some of the arms are shipped into Oman and then in pieces, and then are shipped and then are moved overland into Yemen. It's not a simple thing to interdict. Sometimes we've been successful in it. You could argue we haven't necessarily committed the kind of resources we might have to this, but that's, it's air, sea, and land, the way they've done it.
All right, we have a few questions rolling in, so we'll get through as many as we can in the time allotted. If you're comfortable, can you share your thoughts on the Israeli election?
Sure. Well, we've had the fourth Israeli election. Like the three preceding ones, no one could succeed in putting together a government easily. After the third one, you had a government that was called the National Unity Government. It was certainly a national government. Unity did not describe it. It was really a government almost of paralysis. And, eventually it led to, I would say, look, Prime Minister Netanyahu made a commitment to be the prime minister first and then to rotate to Benny Gantz. The one thing that was built into the agreement is that if they didn't agree on a budget, then the government would collapse. And lo and behold, Prime Minister Netanyahu was never prepared to agree on a budget. So eventually, even though that at one point there was a 3-month extension where we were supposed to work out a budget, he didn't do it, and obviously probably wasn't an accident that he didn't do it. At least Benny Gantz felt that to be the case. So this last election, once again, it was different, I think, than the others, even though the others were similar. These elections are not about left-right issues. They're not about war-peace issues. They became referendum on Bibi Netanyahu. The vote was basically either for Netanyahu or against him. Now, a slight majority of the country is against him. But because you deal with putting together a coalition of parties, the reality of a slight majority against doesn't necessarily translate into the formation of a government. Now, he was backed by 52. There's 120 members in the Knesset. Government is formed when you get to 61. He had 52 that were prepared to recommend him to the president to form the government. Yair Lapid had 45 with the joint list, the Arabs, actually with the joint list with Mansour Abbas's Ram party. These are two Arab parties, meaning one split off and is actually an Islamist party, Mansour Abbas's party, and Gideon Sa'ar, who left the Likud and formed the party New Hope. They weren't prepared to recommend anybody. And so just given the numbers, Rivlin, even though he said this was an ethical problem as well, he gave the mandate to Netanyahu, and he has it, I think, until the beginning of May. He has it for 28 days total. Now, he looks like he has an impossible task because he has those 52. Naftali Bennett of Yamina has basically said he will prevent the fifth election, but on his own, he doesn't have enough, even if he goes with Netanyahu, to get Netanyahu to 61. So Netanyahu, to get to 61, over 61, he needs the Mansour Abbas party, the Ram party. Now, part of his 52 not to confuse everybody, part of his 52 comes from an extreme right party called the Religious Zionist Party. Smotrich and Ben-Gvir are part of it. Ben-Gvir is a Kahanist. They've said they won't be a part of a government that depends on the Arabs, even from the outside. Mansour Abbas wouldn't have to be in the government, but if his vote, he could vote to seat that government and then remain outside of it. The Religious Zionist Party has said they won't be part of a government that has to depend upon the Arabs to be able to seat themselves and to sustain themselves as within a kind of insurance policy. Bennett has said he would join the Netanyahu government only if, in fact, he actually has the votes for a government, meaning he gets both the Arabs and the Religious Zionist Party. One or the other isn't enough. He needs both. And only then Bennett says, okay, if you do that, then I'll join. Now, why has Bennett done that? Bennett has a proposal from Yair Lapid that even though Bennett's party, Yamina, got only 7 mandates out of 120, and Lapid's got 17, that Bennett could be the prime minister for the first year in a rotation agreement as a way of ensuring that Netanyahu is finally removed. And Netanyahu, by the way, is under trial right now. His trial has begun. And Bennett is attracted to becoming prime minister, but he doesn't want to lose his right-wing base in the process. And this government that he would be the prime minister of would have all the center and left parties. It would have Meretz in it. It would have the Labor Party in it. It would have blue-white in it. And he doesn't want to look like he's creating what is a center, basically a center right-left government. And so, because he fears that will cost him his right-wing base. He doesn't want to be prime minister for a year and then lose the prospect of being prime minister for longer over time. So he wants to look like he's not betraying his right-wing base. So what he's done by saying he will join Bibi's government, provided he has a government. And if Bibi can't succeed in putting it together, they said, look, I promised that we would not go to a 5th election. At that point, he's able to form the government with Lapid. By the way, I suspect at that point he can go to one of the religious parties and say, we can't offer you what Bibi could offer you, but we can offer you a whole lot more than 0, which is what you'll get if you're in the opposition. So they could expand the government at that point to include at least one of the religious parties. Now, can Bibi succeed between now and then, given what I described? It's not easy, but I think you wouldn't make a fortune betting against Netanyahu when it comes to sorting out politics. He will maximize his pressure on Smotrich. He knows he has Mansour Abbas doing a deal because he's prepared to pay him off with what he wants. One of the most interesting things about Mansour Abbas is even though he comes from a Muslim, basically a Muslim Brotherhood party, this is the Islamic party in Israel. They're very conservative. They're non-Zionist, but he isn't running on that platform. He's running on what is the concern of Arab constituents. One of the most interesting things about what is happening now is that Arabs who were never part of any government are now being sought after to be part or at least to help form a government. And their price is, okay, fine, integrate us more into Israel. 20% of all the Israeli doctors are Arab. 30% of all the pharmacists are Arab. Go to any supermarket. I would say half of the checkers are either Arab and the other half are Russian. So they're part of the fabric of Israeli life, but they haven't been recognized like that politically. And they get the short shrift when it comes to infrastructure investment. And crime runs rampant there without the kind of serious police effort that is made in the non-Arab parts of Israeli society. And so what he's asking for is investment in infrastructure, in schools, and a more serious police presence. And Bibi, of course, and the truth is, to be fair, the other side would make the same promises, and they're long overdue. So it's interesting that we may be seeing the integration of the Arabs in a much more serious way for the first time as a result of these elections. But the Smotrich Religious Zionist Party wants no part of that. Bibi has to get them to change what has been a very firm posture. He's now using some of the right-wing rabbis to put pressure on them. You can expect that he'll pull out all the stops to try to get them, and you give Bibi another 3 weeks to try to work something out. I wouldn't bet against his ability to do it. I would say it won't be a very stable government, and he'll be subjected to pressures from both ends of that government. But I once said to him that I thought he had more than 10 fingers and 10 toes, because every time there was a leak in the dike, he had the ability to plug it. So we'll see what happens. If he can't put together a government, I think there will be an alternative government that will be formed. Its problem will be that the only thing they agree on is getting rid of Bibi. And so it's not clear that that will be that sustainable a government either. But let's see. Those are the two scenarios. And if they both fail, you're going to have a fifth election.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing, Ambassador Ross. I know that the election's a very complicated issue, so very complex. So appreciate you giving your thoughts in such a well-structured response. Thank you. We do just have a couple more minutes, so only a couple more questions can we take right now. So if we weren't able to get to yours, I'm very sorry. We will try to gather them and maybe get responses out after the lecture. But just in the interest of time, we're only going to take a couple more of our questions. But thank you so much for all of you who have put them in. It's really, it's wonderful engagement, and we really appreciate that. So one question is, has Israel given COVID-19 help to any of the parties? And I assume this is maybe help with vaccinations or otherwise in relation to COVID-19.
There has been a number of agreements between the Emiratis and the Israelis in the pharmaceutical area. It's less immediately related to COVID-19, although they're working on, I think, jointly together, vaccines to deal with variants. The Israelis have vaccinated about 250,000 Palestinians who work in Israel or work in the settlements. I think what you're seeing mostly, especially with the Emiratis and the Israelis, is planning for the next pandemic. That's what I think they're dealing more with.
Thank you. And then this will be our final question for today. Are you able to comment on the US rejoining the nuclear treaty?
Yeah. Look, the Biden position has been during the campaign and afterwards that we would comply again with our obligations of the JCPOA, which were to lift the nuclear-related sanctions, and we would do that in return for compliance by the Iranians. Now that became a sequence issue because it was hard for the administration to say, look, we're going to lift sanctions when you're not in compliance. The Iranians haven't been prepared to operate on that basis because they say the US is the one that withdrew, imposed a high price on us, the US has to go first. They're not willing to talk directly with the administration. The administration is in Vienna with the other members that negotiated the JCPOA with the Iranians. The Iranians are meeting with them, not directly with us. There are two working groups who are set up, one to create a roadmap to get back into lifting the sanctions, the other is to create a roadmap to get the Iranians back into compliance. The Iranians are operating on the basis of trying to maximize their pressure on us by showing that they're going full speed ahead in their nuclear program, which is one of the things that probably led to the sabotage in Natanz, which is where the Iranians do the vast majority of their enrichment, the Iranian enrichment. And what happened there over the weekend probably has set back the Iranian program 6 to 9 months. That actually creates some space for the administration so they don't need to feel pressured into working something out, lest Iran get closer and closer to having a breakout capability. A breakout capability is having the means to create fissile nuclear material, meaning the core fuel of a bomb. Right now, the Iranians, actually, they were supposed to resume today the talks in Vienna. One of the Iranian delegates tested positive for COVID, so they're postponing that. In the meantime, though, the Iranians are trying to ratchet up the pressure by saying they're now going to enrich to 60%. 60% is very close to weapons grade uranium. And just to put it in perspective, in 2012, Bibi Netanyahu at the UN had a diagram where he said if Iran gets one bomb's worth of enriched material to 20%, that would be Israel's red line. I'll just flag for you this as we close. Iran already has more than one bomb's worth at 20% now, and now they're talking about enriching to 60%. And 60%, as I said, is extremely close to the 90% enrichment that is weapons grade.
Wow. Well, once again, thank you so much, Ambassador Ross. I feel that I have a wealth of knowledge just from listening to you for this last about 50 minutes. And I think I can speak for a lot of our audience today. Incredible and very, very informative. And again, thank you to you and thank you to Will for being here and for helping us today in this educational journey. This has been really wonderful. And so I want to say thank you also to all of you for being here and continuing to support the Mandelbaum Family Lecture Series and your dedication to it. Our next one, our actual final lecture of the 2020-2021 Mandelbaum Family Lecture Series will be May 12th with local artist and educator Guri Stark. So I will send out information about that in the follow-up email along with a recording to this lecture. And again, if we weren't able to get to your question, I apologize. We will do our best to collect those and get answers as we can. But again, want to thank you so much for your engagement. And on that note, I'm going to say goodbye. Have a wonderful rest of your week and a wonderful weekend. And thank you so much to all of you.